Welcome back to the South Carolina Teaching Standards Training, Day 1. My name is Faye Colley with the Office of Educator Effectiveness and Leadership Development. In this video, we'll have a quick overview of the observation process and go over hints for capturing evidence with scripting. We will also explain to you the task for this morning. This slide depicts the three key parts of the evaluation process, often referred to as the POP cycle. It is important to note that the pre- and post-conferences are required in the expanded ADEPT evaluation model for classroom-based teachers. This process is based on best practices when supporting teacher growth. Further note that the pre-conference is only required for the preliminary evaluation cycle in the fall. It is best practice for teachers to be notified of the date and time for the pre-conference at least 3 school days in advance. Absent unusual circumstances such as weather and illness, announced observations should occur no later than 2 school days following the pre-conference. If the evaluator is unable to observe the intended lesson, a new pre-conference must be scheduled and conducted. During the pre-conference, the evaluator can ask questions and collect evidence prior to the upcoming observation. Specific evidence on indicators under the planning domain can be gathered. Additionally, teachers can ask their evaluators clarifying questions about the SCTS 4.0 rubric and/or specific indicators within the rubric. Observations are done from bell to bell. Observations are announced during the preliminary evaluation cycle in the fall. Observations are unannounced in the final evaluation cycle in the spring. The post-conference is required for both the preliminary evaluation cycle in the fall and final evaluation cycle in the spring. The post-conference must occur within 5 school days of the observation. Prior to the post-conference, the evaluator will identify an area of reinforcement, or an area of strength, and an area of refinement, an area of improvement. In this video, we'll go over gathering evidence prior to the lesson and during the lesson. This slide shows a graphic which emphasizes that you can gather evidence at the pre-conference by reviewing the lesson plan and asking the questions you generated from the lesson plan. Remember, in the preliminary evaluation cycle, you must conduct a pre-conference, but in the final evaluation cycle, you don't conduct it. So, how might you collect evidence if there is no pre-conference? You can still gather evidence from the lesson plan. Many schools and districts have days set to send week-long lesson plans. Make sure that something similar is set at your school or district so that you can have access to the educator's lesson plans prior to your unannounced observation. This is one of your tasks this morning. Locate the high school English lesson plan in the asynchronous platform. Review the lesson plan and generate questions to seek clarifications on the lesson or help the educator reflect on the lesson. You will find a document in the asynchronous platform to enter at least 3 questions you have on the educator's lesson plan. An example is provided. In Activity 2, what does TC plus BK equals I mean, and how are you planning to do your modeling? After reviewing the lesson plan and completing the document with at least 3 pre-conference questions, your next task is to watch Mr. Campbell's pre-conference. The video is 15 minutes long. As a background, when this pre-conference was recorded, Mr. Campbell taught high school English 9th grade honors class at a charter school. In this charter school, they refer to their students as scholars rather than students. Your task while watching the pre-conference is to enter in this document how the teacher and evaluator behave or interact. You must also note general observations. An example for each column is given. Please fill in 3 more rows. After watching, respond to the 3 questions below the chart. You will find this document in the asynchronous platform. Now, let's shift our focus on gathering evidence during the lesson. This is a graphic reminder that as an evaluator, you collect evidence by paying attention to what the teacher says and does and what the students say and do. The observation must be from bell to bell, even if it is a 3-hour cosmetology class. These are the kinds of evidence you can capture when in the classroom and holding an observation. Capture as much verbatim dialogue as possible. As you internalize the rubric, this process will become more targeted and efficient. Capturing enough verbatim dialogue to accurately score each indicator is key. I either type or do handwritten scripts. In consideration of educators who may be easily distracted by clicking sounds from my laptop, I do handwritten scripts. My handwriting is a mess, but it doesn't matter as long as I can read and understand what I wrote. Remember, as the evaluator, your scripting notes belong to you. Anything entered in SCTS.org as a script is only visible to the evaluator who entered it. As you practice, you will find what works best for you, and these are all only suggestions. Let's get into the details of these. These scripting hints are highly recommended best practices during the observation. As I explain, I will tie my personal style in scripting. Remember, you may have a different style in scripting, but we want you to apply these best practices as much as possible. Time. I usually would capture the time the lesson starts, time when there are major shifts from one activity to another, time when I captured the verbatim evidence, and time when the lesson ends. As an example, I may capture the time the teacher models the lesson or the time students engage in individual, pair, or small group activities. Abbreviate. I make up my own abbreviation, and you can too, as long as you remember how you abbreviated. Remember, your observation notes belong only to you. Verbatim. We always get asked how much verbatim dialogue to capture. The answer is as much as you can. This doesn't mean that you are acting like a court reporter or stenographer. Have a reasonable amount so that you can support your ratings and identify areas of reinforcement and refinement. Make sure to have at least 3 verbatim evidence for each area. You want the educator to know that it is their lesson you observed, and you're not using a generic script of evidence that applies to any class or lesson. Paraphrase. I use a mix of paraphrasing and verbatim evidence. When I want to quickly describe a segment or activity, or describe general behaviors of the students and teacher, I would paraphrase. Circulate. If you plan to circulate, to move around and talk to students, or look at their work as they are working on their task, make sure to let the educator know at the pre-conference so that the educator doesn't feel uncomfortable or awkward. Remember, this is not a gotcha evaluation. Our new evaluation model is a growth model. These hints are highly recommended best practices after observing the lesson. For this slide, we want to highlight the importance of the upfront summary. After you script a lesson, take a few minutes to write an upfront summary. An upfront summary can be a general impression of the lesson with some specific details of the lesson. You can write this in 3 to 5 sentences. For example, Mr. Campbell's English honors lesson started promptly and immediately engaged students with turning objectives into essential questions. A good portion of the lesson involved modeling by the teacher of what BK plus TC equals I mean, using a literary device. The students engaged in multiple activities, including group table discussions and poetry challenge. The lesson wrapped up in a rushed manner. Label. Make sure you label your evidence with the corresponding indicators of the rubric. You will find that some pieces of evidence would have multiple labels since the rubric is holistic and indicators and descriptors are connected. Lesson analysis. Make sure to identify the lesson's primary objective and sub-objectives since standards and objectives tie to student mastery. Questioning and feedback. Questions would be easier to label as you would have already written your script ending with question marks. For feedback, make sure to note academic feedback that teachers and students give one another. Remember that praise is not academic feedback. This is a sample of how some of the scripting notes look like for one evaluator. Again, we emphasize that labeling of indicators next to pieces of evidence should happen after the lesson observation and not during the lesson observation. When you are categorizing evidence, read the rubric, then go through your notes. Label your script with the matching indicators of the rubric as in the examples on this slide. Lastly, we emphasize the need to record time segments when capturing verbatim evidence or when there is a transition in activities in the lesson. This is another example of how some of the scripting notes look like for one evaluator. The use of T for teachers and S for students is strongly suggested as it reminds us that we should be capturing verbatim dialogue. You can label T and S during the observation, but again, label the indicators after the observation. After watching this video, you are also tasked to put your scripting skills into practice. This high school English lesson is posted in your asynchronous platform. As a final reminder, when scripting, avoid the following pitfalls. First, avoid the halo and horns effect. What is this? It is when we immediately like the teacher's style and let that overshadow focusing on the evidence for the lesson, or vice versa. Next, avoid letting the ending of the lesson overshadow the evidence for the entire lesson. Lastly, avoid only focusing on the teacher behaviors. Thank you for watching this video on observation process and scripting. Again, this is Faye Colley with the Office of Educator Effectiveness and Leadership Development.